My name's Ruth Ann. I'm a clinical psychologist and I help people build better, healthier relationships after abuse or betrayal. The root of narcissism is low self-esteem or unstable self-esteem. It's the need to feel special in order to stop yourself from feeling worthless or inadequate. So someone who's bringing that to parenting may well look at their child as an extension of themselves. They want their child to be perfect, to achieve great things in order to validate their worth as a parent. And so a narcissistic parent might be very demanding, might be quite critical, might be very performance and achievement orientated. And those are things that can obviously have a real impact on the child, or indeed the adult who's their child, because you feel so undermined and not accepted for just being you. It's difficult to relax and just be yourself and feel loved and embraced within your family. So someone who's experienced that kind of parenting may be quite self-critical, may be quite harsh and demanding on themselves. They may be very placating, very people-pleasing and quite self-sacrificing because they've tried to do that in order to please the parent. But, people are individuals and different people will respond in different ways. Another person might try to compete and to jostle for status within the family. And so they might actually compete with the parent and try to be better than they are. So it plays out in different ways. But ultimately, the overarching effect is not feeling accepted for who you are, not feeling loved for who you are. And that really having such a major effect on your sense of yourself and your sense of other relationships. So if you've grown up with a very narcissistic parent and it's really affected your self-esteem and it colors the way you see yourself, the way you see other people, and the way you relate to other people, these challenges, they're really too complicated to shrink down to here's a set of techniques in order to fix you. But what I think is really helpful is to try to understand yourself, to try to see yourself through a different lens, to understand the impact that it's had on you, to understand why you might be overly sensitive to criticism or find it difficult to take feedback, or why you may be overly receptive to criticism and everything seems like a major blow, or if someone criticizes you unfairly, you're really slow to recognize that that criticism was designed to put you down. You might find that you're someone who's very self-sacrificing. You might find that you're always trying to please other people around you. And so understanding the effect that that's had on you and what effect that's had on your relationship. So if you are someone who's very people-pleasing, very self-sacrificing, what kind of friendships do you form? What kind of romantic relationships with you form? How do you relate to your colleagues, your boss? So really kind of getting a sense of that whole picture and how you relate to other people and understanding where it's come from and building some awareness of it is really, really important first step. But then I also love to ask people to look for the exception. Who's the friend that you feel more able to be yourself with? Who's the colleague or the boss that you've had or the teacher that you've had that gave you lots of praise and validation, that encouraged you? Where's the teacher who perhaps was super encouraging when you were struggling with something, who didn't put you down? Because those are different experiences. And if you can pay attention to them and really suck in from them what that experience was like to have someone who didn't criticize you, someone who was accepting of your flaws, someone who encourages you, someone who loves you unconditionally, someone who sees you in a different way, drink that in and kind of embrace that experience, let it get under your skin and absorb it, because that can really start to transform the way you see yourself. So some people who've had very narcissistic parents may really try to avoid conflict because of what it does to them. But other people may have a completely different response. They may say, you know what, no one is ever going to mess with me again. And so what they are is they're super sensitive. They're always on the lookout for any kind of criticism, any kind of conflict. They shut it down really quickly because they know what kind of gaslighting games that resulted in their family. And so for some people who've had narcissistic parents, they need to learn how to stand up for themselves. They need to learn to be better advocates for themselves. They need to learn to be more self-accepting. Others may actually need to learn to slow down, to take criticism on board without it being crushing. They may need to learn how to communicate, be a good advocate for themselves, but to do so in a way that is much more gentle and much more effective. So it's really difficult to say, oh, here's a set of techniques, because there is no set of techniques. How people respond to this is individual. The other experiences they've had are individual to them. So I think ultimately it comes down to understanding yourself and really kind of stepping outside of your relationships and looking at what new patterns do you want to develop. Sure. There's a degree of genetics involved in narcissism. So someone who's got that genetic temperament may well pass it down to their children. And of course, the experiences that you have, you may develop a narcissistic strategy to cope with a narcissistic parent. You start to see yourself through their eyes, through the kind of hierarchy and status. That's the way narcissists will view the world. They rank people in terms of how important and how special they are. And so you can start to see yourself in that way, and you want to rank, you want to be special. So yes, absolutely, someone who's highly narcissistic as a parent may well find that they have children who grow up to be highly narcissistic too. So two people within the same family could have a completely different reaction to a narcissistic parent. One person may respond by never letting themselves shine, staying small, placating the parent, always giving them praise, always putting them first, always kind of making themselves small and quiet. Another person might respond completely differently. They might big themselves up. They might try to perform, to achieve, and to get the admiration. Either way, they're kind of navigating challenges with their self-esteem. There's a lack of acceptance for who you are, and there's a lack of unconditional love. So, it is good to have a sense of pride in yourself, a sense of pride in your work. It's good to be pleased with your accomplishments. But with a narcissistic parent, their love is contingent on achievement. It's contingent on performance. A healthy parent loves and accepts their child, however they're doing. Yes, of course, they're going to celebrate when their kid does well. They're going to applaud, they're going to tell their kid how great they're doing, they're going to celebrate that. But if their kid fails, if they flunk something, a healthy parent doesn't go, well, you screwed that up, didn't you? They're like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Don't worry, of course we still love you. You're fine, you're good. We can practice, you can do better at this. We can improve this for next time. So healthy self-esteem, I think, is much more stable. And if you want to build healthy self-esteem, it needs to come with a heavy dose of self-compassion and self-acceptance. I think having that self-understanding, knowing what they bring out on you, I think the concept of an inner child is really helpful. So really be aware that there's a little you inside that feels very threatened, that feels very judged, that's trying to please, or that's going to fight back. So those are kind of coping modes. They're the kind of compensatory strategies. And what you really want to do in relating to anyone who's narcissistic or very, very difficult is to get to know yourself, to kind of meet the needs that that child had, the unmet needs, that need for unconditional love, that need for acceptance. And as you nurture that within yourself, you're also building a healthier adult. You're building a much more sturdy sense of self-esteem. And something I love to do with people is I'll get them to imagine their inner child and go, if you're going to be with someone who's very, very difficult, whether that's a very difficult parent, maybe it's a difficult ex-partner, I want you to imagine putting that little child somewhere safe, or you take them to a friend, or they're going to a babysitter, or they're going to go and do something really lovely. And you also want to have a little word with your coping modes, the people pleaser, the self-sacrificer, or the overcompensator, the major fighter, the one who's not taking any of that nonsense anymore, who's going to kind of go in all guns blazing. And you want to tell them, you know what, guys, you got to hold back. Because me, as my sturdy, healthy, most grown-up self, that's who's going to be handling this. I'm going to talk from that place. I'm going to practice being that person. And I think there's lots of ways to do that. And what often people find helpful is a degree of limiting contact. So, when when the holidays are coming up and it's Christmas, and you know after several days things just get really, really tense, limit the time, make it shorter and sweeter. Make sure that around that time you also see other people, friends or a partner or people who you find very grounding, people who really give you that sense of being loved and accepted. Make sure you're spending time with them. And then really try to come to that relationship from your healthiest, most sturdy grown-up self. If you are on social media, you will think no contact is the only thing you can ever do with a narcissist. And first of all, it's just not feasible for many people, but also it's really rather rare for someone to say, I never ever want to see this person again, especially when it's a parent. With an ex-partner, sometimes that may well be the best approach, unless you have children and you have to have contact. But, are you really going to cut off your entire family and everything that goes along with that? Now, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. For some people, that is what they want to do. And if there's been a huge amount of abuse within a family, maybe that is the safest and the right thing to do. But in my experience, that's very rare. And actually, often when people say, I'm in no contact, they spend their life completely obsessed with the person they're in no contact with. And it's draining to be that angry and that caught up in it. So I much, much prefer to focus much more on when you have contact, how are you? What do you bring to that contact? How can you show up as your most healthy, sturdy self? How can you look after yourself when you have that contact, before and after? And how do you communicate with that person in a way that does justice to you, that is not you placating and pleasing and bending over backwards for them, but neither is it fighting with them? And as you change yourself, inevitably relationships change. The other person will have to change and adjust. Something I love to suggest to people, I have so many people I've worked with who are very, very critical parents, particularly mothers, and they'll say, my mother's so critical, she always nags me, she always tells me all the things I've done wrong, she comments on everything I'm sensitive about, I can never ever measure up. And, we'll often say, well, let's try and understand what's going on for her. And I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying she's right. I'm not saying her behaviour's good. In fact, her behaviour's horrible, right? But let's try and understand, where does it come from? And often when you take a step back, you can realise that's coming from a place of incredible fear. That this mother is looking at her adult child and thinking, I failed as a mother. They're not good enough. It reflects badly on me. It's all catastrophic. I've got to tell them what to do because if I don't, then they're going to screw it up. It's just ridden with anxiety. So I say, your job, hard as it is, you've got to show up confident. And I suggest this to people, and I would say it works a great deal of the time. You say, Mum, I love how you look out for me. You're always trying to make me a better person. Always. But, I think you can relax because I think you did a good job and I think I'm pretty good.
And how do you find that they tend to react to statements like that?
It's very disarming. Reactions vary. The reaction could be, oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did. I'll take the credit for that. It takes the heat out of the situation, and sometimes it can be, well, who do you think you are? But you know what? At least you tried. At least you tried. So look, I can't promise there's no magic bullet. There's no magic way to shape words to get someone to behave differently. But showing up differently, showing up confident, showing up more secure in yourself will certainly have an impact on the relationship. So someone who's looking at their parents and thinking, I'm responsible for you, is very often someone who's had the message that you are responsible for your parents' well-being, you're responsible for their feelings, you're responsible for them. And I guess what I would say is, well, no, you're not. They were the grown-up. And sometimes I think that's a pretty terrible realization, because to realize that, then you realize that you were really failed, that you didn't get the care you needed when you were little, you didn't get the love you needed when you were little. That's really painful. And I'm not someone who wants to demonize parents. I'm really not. That's not what I'm about at all. But I do think when there's been quite significant abuse or neglect, there is a real need to recognize that and to honor your experiences. What often comes on the heels of that is no small amount of resentment, where, you know, someone is looking at their parents and resenting, you weren't there for me, and I sacrificed so much and I have to give so much to you. And often, I often think of it as like, it's like a little child trying to caretake. It's a little child trying to do what a little child simply cannot do. And where I think is very helpful is to, again, just like I said before, it's like, take care of that little child on your own, or with other relationships that you have with people who are healthier, to look after that part of you and bring the adult to your relationship with your parents, which may mean setting some boundaries. It may mean saying no. It may mean sometimes you do things, you provide a degree of care and comfort to your parent, or helping them out, particularly if, you know, as parents get older, they get sick, people can have that real burden of responsibility to their parents, and it's difficult. But if you do that from the grown-up place, even if from the grown-up place you're doing it with a sense of obligation, but without denying what the impact is on you, and without denying the feelings that it has, kind of allowing yourself to have those complexities. Because so often what happens is people do the thing they're supposed to do and then feel really guilty that they resent it. And I'm like, you're allowed to feel a bit resentful, actually. It's okay. You're allowed to feel annoyed. You're allowed to feel like you can give to your parents and care for them, and recognize that there may have been ways where they didn't give you good enough care. You know, let's talk about what we mean by empathy. So empathy is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and imagine what life would be like for them. And yes, that's very helpful. That doesn't necessarily mean sympathy. It doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't even necessarily mean compassion. It just means understanding who this person is and what their experiences are. And I think that's very helpful, because when you understand that a narcissistic parent or a narcissistic partner or a narcissistic colleague, whoever it is fundamentally driven by a deep-rooted sense of shame, by low self-esteem that they're constantly trying to regulate, and doing so in ways that are pretty toxic, pretty horrible for people around them, it helps to depersonalize it. It helps you to see, this is not about me, this is about who they are, how they are in the world, and their experiences. So I think that's really helpful. I also think that can be so helpful when it comes to how you communicate with them, to knowing how what you say is going to come across, so you can be thoughtful and considered in what you say to them and how you put it, which is not me saying tiptoe on eggshells and let them get away with everything. It's maybe being a bit more strategic and allowing that empathy to better inform how you communicate, so you can improve things for you. Well, don't say I think you're a narcissist. What I would say is that when you have that empathy for them, you understand where they're coming from, and you also understand what the impact is on you, and you're able to come at it from a much more healthy, sturdy place. You're much less shaken by criticism. You're much less personally disturbed and worried about what they think and what they say and what they're going to do. If you feel like you can cope, with it, I think you can bring something new to the relationship. And so definitely don't call them a narcissist. That never goes well. But what I would say is, let's think a little bit about boundaries. And by boundaries, I don't mean how to get them to do what you want them to do. I mean, how are you going to respond to behaviors that are offensive to you? But within that, I think there's a tendency to make boundaries all about, these are the rules, and I'm going to set the rules, and you're going to do this, and I'm going to do this. That's really, really not helpful. I think what's far more helpful is to think about the relationship as a whole, because the chances are this is not a wholly negative relationship. There may be aspects of your parent that you value, that you appreciate. You may be able to see their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. You might actually have quite a level of compassion for them around those things. There may be aspects of them that are quite fun, that are quite dynamic, that are quite exciting. At their best, they may be there may be really wonderful qualities, and at their worst, there may be really terrible qualities. So I think appreciating the whole picture is really, really important, because it's also really helpful to give feedback to someone about the things that you like and appreciate, especially if you're then going to tell them maybe some of the things that are causing you some difficulties. And so when you think about boundaries, I would say think much more about how am I going to respond, and what's the direction that I want to take this relationship in. So not what are the rules of engagement, no, that's not what you're negotiating. You want to think about how am I going to shape this relationship for me. And so that might be really thinking about when things go wrong, what makes things more difficult, and what you want to do. And so that might be, maybe you want to spend less time, because when you spend too much time, things get too heated. Maybe you want to increase the frequency but reduce the duration. Maybe you're going to say, you know what, Mum, I love the time I have with you. I love our conversations, but I've got to be honest with you. I know it's not your intention, but when you drink, you say some things that are pretty vile, actually, and it's hurtful. So I'm not here for that. And so when you start drinking, I'm going to go. That might be a boundary. I'm not saying that's the boundary you should set. These have to be very, very individuals. It's got to be what is good for you and what you need within your family and within your setup. But I think thinking about how you're going to respond rather than what they're going to do is really, really helpful. Also, when you do that, it's really helpful to communicate your intention. So you want to be saying, I want us to have a good relationship. I want us to enjoy our time together. I want us to be close. I want us to share these things. And because when you do that, it's much, much less threatening. You're not coming in with a rule book dictating the rules and the terms of engagement that someone else is going to react to with defensiveness. It's much more invitational. I want to enjoy our relationship more. And in order for me to do that, this is what I need to change. Or this is what I'm not going to stay around for. Or this is what I'm going to do. No, but, I'm not aware of any research on this, but my experience, my inkling would be that there may be a relationship between having a narcissistic parent and then going on to have a narcissistic partner, because your experiences at home will have shaped who you are and what you bring to relationships. So if it has shaped you to be someone who's very self-sacrificing, who's very pleasing, who doesn't want to shine, who doesn't want to outshine your parent, because if you outshine your parent, then you're in really big trouble. Well, that is very attractive, potentially, to someone who really wants to shine, who doesn't want their partner to outshine them, who wants a partner who's going to big them up, who wants a partner who's going to be very self-sacrificing. There's a familiarity that can just click right in. But it's certainly not, you're not doomed to it. And actually having self-awareness of those patterns and intentionally trying to change those patterns. So if that's the position you find yourself in, when you are dating, when you're meeting new potential romantic partners, you really want to look out for those patterns. Like, is this a relationship maybe where you feel very comfortable, but when you think about it, you play small. You don't challenge yourself. You big the other person up. You see them as better than you in some way, or you're constantly trying to please them. Even if that feels comfortable, I think you need to put some big question marks over that. And also to recognize that when you meet someone who isn't like that, who's much more collaborative, who sees you as their equal, who doesn't tell you what to do, who sees you as an autonomous adult, who doesn't need to be told, who doesn't need instructions, they trust you. That may feel a bit anxiety-provoking. That might feel a bit overwhelming at times, but maybe that's discomfort to lean into and let yourself have a bit more of if you want to change those patterns. Another issue, if you've had a very narcissistic parent, is you may have a real sense of not being loved. You may have a real unmet need for validation, for recognition. And so a narcissistic partner who has fantasies of ideal love, who holds out that promise that they will love you perfectly, can be really appealing, can be very, very attractive. So it's one of those things. I think you really need to understand you as an individual and what impact your experiences in your family, and also other experiences with teachers, with friends, with other family members, how all of those have shaped you and what particular vulnerabilities you may have in your relationships. If you've grown up with a narcissistic parent who hasn't given you a sense of unconditional love, of being accepted for who you are, you may have that real longing for someone who will love you in that way. And a narcissistic person will often have fantasies of ideal love too. And so they may well come in as your knight in shining armor, holding out certainty, holding out this promise of perfect love, adoration. And that's enticing, it's appealing. And it may feel like love to you because that's also maybe how your parent treated you when they were at their best. But in a way, that's also a narcissistic defense because it's based on a kind of spectacular love, an extraordinary kind of love. It's not that relaxed, easy self-acceptance that you would find in a healthy relationship, especially a healthy parent-child relationship where a parent accepts the child for who they are, is of course going to celebrate their successes. Of course, they're going to be proud of them, but they're also going to be supporting them. They're going to be aware of their weaknesses. They're going to be encouraging. They're going to be willing to correct and have some boundaries. The whole package needs to be there. And often when that kind of healthier relationship where the whole package is there may feel a little bit uncomfortable. It may feel not dramatic enough. It may not feel great enough. It's not extraordinary enough. So the narcissistic partner becomes very appealing, and the ordinary, much more healthy partner looks a little boring or a little uncertain or a little unnerving. I wish it was so easy. And I talk about healthy relationships, but actually, I don't think the lines are so clear. I mean, clearly some behaviors are toxic. Someone who's emotionally abusive, physically abusive, sexually abusive, financially exploiting you, lying to you, betraying, cheating on you in a persistent way. Of course, that is toxic. That's not a good relationship to be in. But, people in healthy relationships, they're not on best behavior all the time. They bicker, they fight, they have disagreements, they have bad days, they snap at each other, sometimes they're critical of each other. So I think you really have to see the whole picture and appreciate the whole picture and appreciate the really good aspects of a relationship as well as the really bad bits of a relationship, and kind of weigh them up, actually. That is a very big and very difficult question. And the answer is not simple. And I think particularly when you're looking at toxic relationships, where you have lots of people all around you always saying, this person is bad news. They're a cheat, they're a liar, they're abusive, they're condescending, they're everything you don't want in a partner. There's a humiliation in that. Because there's a real sense of, how did I end up with this monster? How did I end up with this terrible person? And it's not straightforward, because that narcissistic person who is a really not a good person in a relationship for you, or this relationship's gone very, very wrong, has some good qualities, has some redeeming qualities. And what will tend to happen is you can hone in on those and actually start to ignore or minimize all the other things, especially if people around you are telling you how awful this person is. So I think what's really needed is time and space and recognition that this is not a straightforward decision, and that you, as the person who's in the relationship, has to be the one to have the agency to make that decision. It's not something anyone from the outside can or should ever tell you what to do. And I also think, look, it's difficult, even when a relationship is clearly toxic or clearly abusive. There's many reasons why people stay. It's not easy to get out. And, there's actually good reason to recognize that getting out can be dangerous. If someone may be physically abusive, that can escalate at the point at which someone leaves. So sometimes you actually need to get advice from organisations that specialise in helping people with domestic abuse. You may even need to get the police involved. It can be that serious. And other times people are concerned about leaving. If they have children together, what's the effect that that's going to have on the children of leaving? And maybe then the children end up having a lot of one-on-one time with the other parent. People can often be really concerned about that. And of course, culturally, different cultures have very different views of relationships ending and different views of divorce. So that's really challenging. There can be financial reasons as well. Splitting one household in two is no small feat. And of course, a highly narcissistic partner may well drag it through the courts. So leaving is not easy and it's not straightforward. And I think we're really too quick often to say to people, well, you should just leave, go no contact, and it's not that simple. What I often will suggest to people is that rather than focusing on the relationship itself, build yourself up, nurture other friendships, nurture yourself, because as you build that healthier sense of yourself, you can also start to build a picture of what life might be like with or without this relationship. And I'll often encourage people as part of that, go and speak to, if they're married, go and speak to a divorce solicitor. You don't have to agree to anything. You don't have to tell anyone else you're doing it, but do it for yourself. Find out the lay of the land, find out all of the information so you can make a very careful and very considered decision. So not a rash or snappy decision. And I think what's also really important is to recognize that decision is not straightforward. Everyone will make it out like it's straightforward. It isn't. There's tremendous cost and there's loss either way. If you stay in a relationship with someone who you know they're not good for you, you know the relationship isn't a good one, but that you're staying in it because there's other reasons that make it hard to leave, owning that and acknowledging that there is a loss and a pain associated with it. And at the same time, if you leave, there's also a loss of all the dream, all the hope, all the thoughts that you had, that sense of resignation, the sense of maybe admitting that everyone around you was right all along about this other person. That comes with its own heartbreak and its own pain. So I think these are really complicated decisions, and anyone who puts themselves forward as having the answer to those decisions is deluding themselves. I think, and when I work with people who are in that situation, I really try to say to myself, come at this humble, because you do not know. I do not know what this person is going through. I do not know what situation they're in, and it's really difficult. Well, first of all, I would suggest don't say, I think your partner's a narcissist and you should go no contact immediately. Okay, I would say come at this humble, because you do not know. And what I'd also suggest is you're going to look at this situation and you're going to see all the reasons that you hate this partner, and you may well be right. They may well be the monster that you see them as being. But for your friend to be told that is humiliating. And what you also do in telling your friend, well, you've got to leave, is you're taking away your friend's agency. Your friend needs to make that decision. So what I would suggest is spend time with your friend, big them up, really remind them of all their good qualities, all the wonderful qualities. Let them experience in you. I often think relationships are like a mirror. And if you're in an abusive relationship, you're looking at a distorted mirror, because the image of yourself coming back at you is distorted by the way that they see you and the way that you treat you. So be a better mirror. Show your friend that appreciation, validate where they're coming from. And if they are talking about their relationship, I would say be very respectful and say, this is hard. Tell them that you don't envy their situation. I'd also say, express to them, this is hard, but I also know you're going to figure it out. Because when you communicate it like that, I trust you to figure this out, you're kind of giving your friend agency. And you can also say, look, whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm here. And I'm not telling you to leave, but if you need a place to crash, if you need a place to stay, you can come to mine. So let him know that's available. I think that's really good. But what you really want to do is be so respectful and so honoring of their agency. Because if they do leave, it really, to be sustainable, to not be the boomerang where it's like, I'm leaving, I'm back, I'm leaving, I'm back, on repeat. To not be that, I think it needs to come from a much more sturdy, strong place within, where it's like, no, I'm really going. and I've thought about it and I've planned it very carefully. People don't leave these relationships effectively without quite some degree of planning. No. No. And, if you're in a relationship that's a bit tricky and a bit difficult, and all relationships are tricky and difficult at times, okay? Um, if you're going to stay in the relationship with someone, then there needs to be a degree of recognition that any change process is going to take time. If there's been a betrayal, it's going to take time to rebuild trust. If there's been hurts, it's going to take time to heal. If someone has patterns where maybe they're very critical, maybe they're very condescending, it takes time to change those patterns. It's not a quick process. And I would also say that, if you look at TikTok, Instagram, social media therapists will say, this is how you fix your relationship. And they sound robotic. They don't sound like humans at all. And, real relationships, people don't behave perfectly. They don't talk about boundaries. They don't talk about, validate my feelings. We all have our weaknesses. We all have our foibles. We all have our little idiosyncrasies. And good relationships accept those. Accept that, maybe your partner is going to be a bit of a grump on occasion. Maybe when they're at their worst, they're going to be condescending. But what can happen is those edges can come off. And things can be built differently. Things can be changed, but that is a long and slow process. I think if both partners are genuinely up for it, it's a very possible process, even when there's narcissism in the mix. But I stress, both partners. You cannot make the other person change. You can change yourself, and that will have an effect on them and what they do. But fundamentally, what I would say is, for all their difficulties, can you love your person as they are? Can you love them for who they are? Beautiful example. I remember someone saying, I was a real asshole. I really was an asshole. And lots of beeps. And the partner responded, but you're my asshole, right? So there's an acceptance there. And there's not an excuse. There's not a saying, oh, it's okay, I'm going to make excuses. There is an acceptance that we all are assholes on occasion. So look, it's not easy, and I think the internet tries to make it far, far too simple, and there is a need for acceptance, and people don't behave perfectly all the time. Healthy couples bicker, they fight, they have disagreements. What healthy couples are good at is repairing. They're good at apologizing. They're good at restoring the relationship. They're good at coming back to each other and rebuilding connection. And that happens over and over and over again. That is not a toxic pattern. That is a normal, healthy relationship. That there are times you're going to misunderstand each other. There are times you're going to have stupid arguments. You're going to be petty. You're going to be grumpy. But you can come back together and you can acknowledge it and you can appreciate each other and the relationship for how it is. If you have an entrenched pattern in your relationship, I think there needs to be a very big dose of compassion for yourself, for what you're experiencing in this relationship, and for your partner and what they're experiencing. Now, I want to be really clear here. I am not talking about abuse. I'm not talking about persistent lying. I'm not talking about having compassion or making excuses for someone. None of that, okay? There are some things, relationships are not 50-50. Sometimes one party is more to blame than the other, and that needs to be on the table. You can't deny that or write that off. But at the same time, to come at a relationship, if it's going to work, there needs to be acceptance. There needs to be compassion for each other. There needs to be a sense of not being judgmental, to accept that your partner may have some difficult attributes. And by difficult attributes, again, I don't mean abuse. I mean, maybe they're messy. Maybe they don't pick their socks up off the bathroom floor. Maybe when they're in a bad mood, they go really quiet and sulky. Those are the things that we all have to tolerate. We all have to accept in our partners, and that's okay. And, those are things that some things can change. Other patterns some things are permanent, Someone may never learn to pick their socks up off the bathroom floor, however simple it may seem. And other things there may be work to do. If someone is persistently lying or cheating, there are questions to be asked. What drives that behaviour? And if they're willing to look at it and they're willing to own it, and they're willing to take responsibility for it and the impact it has on their partner, then change may be possible. But so often in my work, it's the wrong person asking the question. Because when it's the person who says, look, I cheated, I lie, I do it because I don't want to disappoint my partner, but with the truth. So I hide things because I'm ashamed of them, or I cheat, and these are the patterns that drive that behavior without excusing it, without justifying it. None of this is an excuse. None of this is to justify it. It's about understanding it. Then I'm pretty hopeful for their capacity to, one, change their pattern, especially if they can fully acknowledge, this impacts my partner in a really, really bad way. And it's got nothing to do with my partner. It's entirely to do with me. I think that person I'm really hopeful for. But so often the heartbreaking thing is the person coming to me is the partner saying, this person has cheated on me umpteen times. Or this person has emptied the bank account, spent our life savings. Or this person is consistently condescending, always putting me down. And then it's like, well, the wrong person's asking the question. I'm really hopeful about the potential for change when someone who needs to change wants to change. Focus much more on yourself and what your experiences are, and don't assume you're right. There may be many explanations for someone's behavior. And, so many people come into my office convinced that their partner's a narcissist or that they're a narcissist. Something else is going on. And that requires careful assessment and consideration. So I would say what you can know is the effect that it has on you and what it's doing to you. And I think that's the much more important thing to pay attention to, rather than trying to make a psychiatric diagnosis. I'm Dr. Ruth. I help people build healthier relationships after abuse and betrayal. You can find me at drruthanharpur.com. You can also find me, Dr. Ruth Ann Harpur, on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. I've just spent the day filming with Mindfriend, so do stay tuned for some more content.